Lovely. Thanks, Julie, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. My name's Vicky Cutler. I'm an independent health and safety consultant and vice chair of the IIRSM Scotland branch. We're delighted to welcome along Matt Dawes, who is an asbestos specialist, to talk about asbestos management in a wide variety of guises this evening. I was going to do a short introduction on about Matt and his experience, but actually I'm going to let him do that himself. We'll be delighted to take questions from you. So if you do have any of those, as Julie said, please use the question function on the system, and we'll get to those as we move through the presentation. Further ado, over to you, Matt, and thank you for delivering this for us this evening.
Okay, thank you, Vicky. Good evening, everyone. As Vicky said, my name is Matt. I'll introduce myself more formally in a moment. But I'm going to have a very brief chat today about asbestos management, with a little bit of talking about risk assessment and finishing up with the rough contents of what an asbestos management plan would be expected to contain. A lot of the information that I'm going to talk about is going to be based around the UK legislation. So if we have got any overseas viewers on, you may have to just reference that with your local legislation, if there are any for your region. So in terms of the session that we're going to put on today, we're going to start to talk about asbestos management and discuss how and what we're trying to achieve when it comes to asbestos management. It's a subject matter, I think, that perhaps doesn't get the coverage that it warrants in some respects. So we'll talk about how we can get there, what sort of options there are, and again, as I mentioned, core requirements for the asbestos management plan. And one of the things that I want to talk about as well is to try and normalise some of the processes that surround asbestos management, so that it's not this mysterious thing, I suppose, that people don't necessarily talk about. And I've hopefully timed my session in such a way that we've got plenty of time for questions at the end, as Vicky mentioned. So I think from a perspective, first and foremost, that's me. As mentioned, my name is Matt. I have worked as an asbestos consultant for almost 20 years this year, actually. I'm a certified competent person in relation to asbestos. And all of my experience in respect to asbestos consultancy is vocational. So I've spent the last 20 years doing pretty much everything on a consultancy basis, whether that's analytical air testing, certificates of reoccupation, asbestos surveying in a multitude of buildings. I did have a little 3-year period away from consultancy when I went to work as the client. So I had 3 years where I was the technical officer looking after asbestos for a medium-sized housing association in the Midlands. I've operated as a technical manager for a regional office and as a training manager as well. And over the last 4 years, up until July last year, I was the director of the UK Asbestos Training Association, which was a peer-elected position. So I enjoy the subject matter that I'm talking about, and I think it is something that, as I say, to me is quite an important topic, because there is still an air of mystery, and the only way we unveil these mysteries is by encouraging dialogue surrounding the subject matters. So in terms of the starting point, I suppose, when it comes to asbestos, one of the things that I considered when I was placing this together is, what is it that ultimately we are trying to achieve when we talk about asbestos management? Now, there's a vast array that I could place into this slide. But realistically, what I wanted to consider and what I perceive to be the sort of 4 main objectives. And top of it all is to prevent people from being exposed to asbestos. I think realistically, when you look at asbestos and asbestos management and the various other legislative requirements of asbestos, it really does boil down to preventing people from being exposed, because ultimately, asbestos being a mineral, it's naturally occurring. It hasn't got an agenda, and therefore, if we are not disturbing the asbestos and it's in good condition, it's in our buildings, then exposure is not going to happen, and then asbestos is simply a hazard that we can manage, and it doesn't sort of progress into becoming a risk, and we'll talk about that as well shortly. One of the other points of asbestos management is to control how works are undertaken on sites in terms of construction or general maintenance work, be able to understand and control those activities from an asbestos perspective. And I think, again, one of my bugbears is that people don't think about asbestos as one of the priorities, as one of the first things we're talking about. Asbestos is often viewed after the event or a little bit too late, so everything then ends up rushed. And planning is an integral part of asbestos management. Asbestos remediation, obviously there has been various topics and discussions within the UK government and Parliament over the last couple of years in respect to what the future plan for asbestos management is likely to look like. And the sort of cold hard facts are that there's not expected to really be a huge amount of change in regards of what asbestos management look like, which is why I'm fairly confident in delivering that this session that we're not going to have the goalpost moved anytime soon. And another point of asbestos management is to bring it to the fore, is to make people more aware of asbestos, to make it more of a normal subject matter. And I think that for me is a key part of asbestos management as well. A lot of the times there is a significant stigma attached to the word asbestos, and we can appreciate why with the legacy that asbestos holds in the UK. The number of people that are succumbing to asbestos illness in the UK and globally, indeed globally. We're talking about 6 figures of fatalities caused by asbestos exposure every year around the world. It's not an insignificant number. And I think that's why, again, it is important. So why do we need to manage asbestos? I think the first starting point when we look at it is the legislative requirements. So I've placed there, let's talk legislation, and then what I've kind of considered is most people's reaction to that starting point, because the prospect of legislation is something that a lot of the time people balk at. But again, it's an integral part of asbestos management. There are various reasons as to why, whether we start with the Health and Safety at Work Act and the general requirements for looking after people's safety caused by our work, or whether we look further down and drill down into the control of asbestos regulations and specifically Regulation 4, which is the duty to manage. But I think one of the regulations that perhaps doesn't get as much press or media coverage would be Regulation 5. And when we look at the asbestos regulations from that point of view, Regulation 5 is very all-encompassing, essentially stating that any work carried out by any employer on any building should consider asbestos if they're likely to disturb the fabric of the building whilst the work's taking place. And then obviously we've got things like construction design and management regulations, which are more recently, as well as certain aspects of COSH and the management of health and safety at work regulations. A lot of focus when it comes to asbestos is placed on Regulation 4, which is the duty to manage asbestos in non-domestic premises. And one of the things I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation is where does that leave us if we are looking at a domestic setting, if we are a landlord, for instance. But I think from my perspective, when we look and drill down into the asbestos regulations, which again isn't everybody's cup of tea, and I appreciate that, but the crux of the matter comes down to complying with various aspects. But ultimately, if we consider Regulation 11 of the asbestos regulations, which states that people shouldn't be exposed to asbestos, all of the other regulations are really setting out to try and achieve compliance with that in various routes and passageways. We've then also got the civil side of things. Obviously, we have a duty of care to people to protect them from harm caused by our activities or by our buildings. Our buildings shouldn't cause harm to individuals, and that can be included such as poorly conditioned asbestos, resulting in people getting exposed, or even our works causing people to be exposed circumstantially. We both have a legal and a civil liability there. And then obviously the other two aspects of health and safety, the moral aspect of it and the publicity side of things. And the publicity side of things is the one that I'm going to focus on for the next couple of minutes. A lot of the time when we talk about asbestos, the publicity can have a greater impact than any sort of significant fines issued by enforcement bodies or local authorities. And one of the case studies that I've pulled off is a fairly recent one and a fairly significant one in terms of asbestos management. And interestingly, it wasn't actually brought as a prosecution by the Health and Safety Executive because it was a retail client. So this is a retail client who was prosecuted by a local authority environmental health department for asbestos management failings. Now this is quite unusual. A lot of environmental health enforcement officers will by their own admission in discussions that I've had with them, they will generally leave things like asbestos to the HSE where they can. But the fine of £565,000, that's quite a significant fine for asbestos management failures. Additional to that, we've got the cost of £75,000 and a victim first surcharge of a nominal £15. But this prosecution, from reading, it's a legacy from 10 years or more of mismanagement. And again, one of the things that I've seen as a consultant over the years is people paying lip service to asbestos and commissioning asbestos surveys, not fully appreciating, number one, what they should be looking for with the asbestos surveys that they've paid significant sums for, but then number two, not dealing with the asbestos risk, if you like, which quite often isn't actually identified in the survey. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a couple of slides' time. But that's just one prosecution. Health and Safety Executive's website has got a number of those, and you can use the search function to search for asbestos prosecutions, and it'll bring up anything relating to that, including things that weren't necessarily immediately prosecuted as asbestos, so things that were prosecuted under construction and design and management regulations. And then these are a couple of civil claims that I've found just online. And it's quite interesting when we look at asbestos and the terminology and the language that's used in the media. And it's almost presented as comedy. The word blunder. The word blunder is something that personally, I can't remember the last time I used that word, but in both of these cases, the word blunder is used in regards to people's failings in regards to asbestos. Again, both of them from a housing point of view. Again, it's based around this duty of care that housing associations and organisations owe to their customers, but that we all owe to anybody who could be affected by our works. And both of those were instances where asbestos had been left exposed or asbestos had been disturbed during renovation works. And in real terms, if we have asbestos at the forefront of our thinking when we are planning these sort of works in, then these scenarios don't happen. And I think that's quite an important topic, because again, the press coverage, the media coverage that you associate with these can be as damaging to businesses as the fine that we discussed on this slide here. So that's just an interesting kind of take on it. So starting off then with asbestos management, we've sort of established that we need to manage asbestos. And I think the next point really is to consider how are we going to manage asbestos? What does this look like? And what I did when I was placing this together, I took an established system, and the 5 steps to risk assessment is something that is widely recognised in the health and safety community, and it also works with asbestos with a few little sort of deviations. So when we typically talk about risk assessing, we use the likelihood multiplied by consequence equation, but with asbestos it's slightly different. And I'll talk about that over the next 10 minutes or so. So the first step to a risk assessment is to identify the hazard. And some of you on this webinar will have had asbestos surveys carried out. And the purpose for asbestos surveys are to complete stage 1 of the risk assessment. And that's to find the asbestos. We know that. We know that the asbestos is the hazard that we're looking at. So what we've then got to think is, how are we going to assess this? How are we going to calculate this? And in real terms, what is this actually going to tell me? What is the information in the survey going to tell me? Frequently, this is covered by the material risk assessment. And remember again, this is the hazard that we're discussing here. And we've got 2 items. These items are both pictures that I've taken, and they're both from the same building. On the left-hand side, we've got sprayed coating to a steel beam. On the right-hand side, I've got it's essentially an asbestos cement windowsill. So they're both asbestos-containing materials. They're both in the same location, both in the same room, if you like. But in terms of the hazard, which is what the survey is going to tell me, the spray coating on the left-hand side is a greatly significant hazard in comparison to the windowsill. And this is calculated using the material assessment algorithm. So the material assessment algorithm is comprised of 4 variables, all of which are designed to tell us what the potential for fibres to be released from the material is. This is all it tells us. This has no impact on how many people are in the room. What's the potential for people to be exposed? What this looks at is how easy are the fibres to be released. So the variables that we have are the product types and what was the asbestos added to. And that's an important consideration, because obviously asbestos, first and foremost, was an additive. It was added to a number of different materials to enhance them, reinforce them for the various properties asbestos has. The second point that we consider is the extent of damage. Is it damaged? Is it highly damaged? Is it scratched? These are all things that are considered and scored. The next is the surface treatment, and that is the material sealed? Are the fibres well contained in the matrix of the material? And then the fourth point that we've got there is the asbestos type, which, from a personal point of view, I'm not a big fan of being able to sort of go, oh, white asbestos or chrysotile only scores 1 in comparison to blue asbestos, which scores 3, and then we've got the others that are scoring 2. I think it does lead to people sort of having a preconception that white asbestos is safe, and that is still something that is sort of spoken about on training courses even, and it's just ultimately asbestos is carcinogenic, whether it's white, brown or blue. The thing that we will sort of secede to is that chrysotile is a slightly lower risk than chrysidolite and amosite, for instance, but in reality a slightly lower risk is still a risk. So this calculated, we add it together. You can see if you look at the numbers, and the lowest score we can have for a material is a 2, and the highest score we can get is a 12. Something scoring 12, this is what the survey is going to tell us. It doesn't automatically mean it's a problem. It means it has a great potential for being a problem. So then we look at the second phase of risk assessments, and this is where a lot of asbestos management systems and plans begin to fall down, simply because it hasn't been completed. So if we haven't completed the second phase and looked at who's going to be harmed, how are they going to be harmed, what's the potential for harm, then all we're looking at is managing hazards. So the priority risk assessment algorithm, which is the second phase of the overall asbestos risk assessment, again, it's broken down into 4 categories, and we've got normal occupant activity, the likelihood of disturbance, how easy is the asbestos to get to, the human exposure potential, so how many people are in the room, how often they're in the room, how long are they in the room, and then things like maintenance activity, so how often is repair work required or carried out even. And as I've written here, some asbestos surveyors will complete this on the client's behalf, and some are accredited to do so. But unless they work with the client, how can they ever provide anything other than an educated, albeit sometimes a very well educated guess, but still a guess? And you look at some of these topics, such as the number of occupants. As an asbestos surveyor, when I'm taking samples, the number of occupants in the room are none, because nobody is permitted to be in the room while I'm taking my samples. And likewise with maintenance activities, as an asbestos surveyor, unless I have a dialogue with yourselves as the duty holder, as the responsible person, as somebody that knows the site, how would I be able to understand how often repair work is required? And I think these are very easy sort of errors to identify, if you like. And I've got an example on the next slide here. These are examples from 2 separate surveying companies, and of the same building, of the same item, and the survey on the left was completed in January 2019, and the extract on the right was completed in April 2019. And it really is kind of the epitome of what I'm talking about asbestos surveyors, and the lack of consistency that you do sometimes see within them. So the one on the left-hand side have completed both the material and the priority risk assessment, and they're given it an overall risk assessment of 10. That's 10 out of 24. You can see that just on the bottom there where it says asbestos present, yes, and the number 10. The one on the right, we've got a total risk score. It's not the 4 that's in the big writing there. The total risk assessment score for the one on the right is given to a 5. So essentially, the surveying company on the left-hand side has decided it's 10, and the surveyor on the right-hand side has decided it's a 5. That's quite a significant difference when we then pop this information into a database and try and risk manage it. And again, that's the risk that is run when asbestos surveyors are kind of leading, if you like, without input from the client. That's just one example. I could pull up very many of those, but I don't want to get too boring on that. The third point then We take those two scores, we add them together. As I mentioned, unlike general risk assessments, which are multiplied, we take the material score, we add it to the priority score. And that gives us a baseline, it gives us a benchmark. But as Health and Safety Guidance Document 227, which is a comprehensive guide to managing asbestos in building states, the algorithms can help you assess the risk. They don't tell you what to do with them. And once we've scored and risk assessed the asbestos, we need to put action plans in place for each individual asbestos homes. And in reality, this is where organisations sort of can really sort of progress or fail, I suppose is the best way of putting it, because this is the legwork. This is where the resources are sort of absorbed, is this initial risk assessment. Because once we've got it in place, then it becomes a simple case of periodically inspecting these items and checking things don't change. So the legwork is in this initial risk assessment. Again, using the 5 steps, record and implement it. And somebody once said to me, if you don't write something down, then technically speaking, it didn't happen. And that's something that I've taken over the last sort of 10 years to sort of almost preach. So it's important that we document these things, simply because if we don't write it down, then it's very easy to forget things. And also, if we are going to document things, we can set ourselves our benchmarks. It's very easy to evidence to any stakeholders or anybody else that's interested, even down the road of implementing KPIs for inspection frequencies, etc., etc. And I think that for me is one of the sort of key reasons for recording it. And then the final point is to review and update. And when we look at risk assessing asbestos, because of the topics that we're going to consider in the priority assessment, for instance, the number of people in the room, well, that can change. The use of a building can change. We may have, for instance, a church hall, which is used for very low disturbance activities, but then one day they decide that they're going to have indoor 5-a-side competitions held. All of a sudden, the risk of the asbestos ceiling in that church hall getting damaged, it increases significantly, and that's something that we're obliged to complete a risk assessment and review of. We've also got considerations that we'd have to implement in terms of the occupants of the building. We have a population with a widely diverse range of needs, and therefore the potential for asbestos to be damaged can increase dependent on the people who are in the building. And that's something, again, as a surveyor, how could I pick that up? How would I know this? Following an incident, I think following any incident where asbestos gets disturbed, obviously we're looking down the road of things like reporting incidents and things like that, but there should be catalysed a review, and we should look at how the incident has occurred. And I think when we look at that prosecution that was held, that organisation, in my opinion there, would automatically trigger a review of all of the asbestos in their buildings there, because if there's a failing in one building, the chances are there may be failings in others, and so we need to look at that in a lot more detail. And then obviously we've got the annual reinspection or the annual audit and review of an asbestos management plan. And then we consider reinspection. Now, reinspection of asbestos containing materials, for some reason, we've somehow adopted over a number of years that everything asbestos has to be inspected every year. And there's this arbitrary concept that people have of inspecting asbestos once a year. And that to me is indicative of that there's no risk assessment being completed, because there are certain asbestos items where inspecting once a year is just simply not going to be enough. And there are other items where we may extend that inspection frequency to 2 years. But again, it's that starting point for me is to complete the risk assessment. Without the risk assessment, it's almost like a house of cards, and things can fall down the wayside very, very quickly. I think that the bottom point that I've made there is that it is an ongoing and evolutionary process, and simply because we've got a survey document, that does not sort of absolve ourselves of being required to manage asbestos. The survey is really the starting point, or the surveys, because over the lifetime of a building, there are going to be multiple surveys. As part of this topic, I'm not really going into the sort of standards and types and specification requirements of surveys, but I can spend you another 4 hours explaining those. So in terms of HSG 227, which I mentioned earlier on as being a comprehensive guide to managing asbestos in buildings, you can see quite clearly this is just an extract that I've pulled. One of the commonly encountered errors on clients' asbestos management is that we've completed a survey, we've found the asbestos, and then we've popped it in a drawer and felt that we are compliant. So what happens then is that people may be exposed, or they may expose others. So how can we get around that? We should inform people of the surveys, we should develop our management plan, we should do what I've just stated in those 5 steps to complete the risk assessment. And then, summarising, every asbestos installation in the non-domestic aspect of a business has to be risk assessed. That's not the case once we go beyond the front door of a domestic property, because the Title 4 Regulation 4, which is the duty to manage asbestos, is the duty to manage asbestos in non-domestic premises. Once we go beyond the front door, that ceases to sort of be a requirement. There are plenty of other requirements in the legislative circle, if you like, and the more wider reaching duty of care. So it doesn't mean we can ignore asbestos in the domestic property, but it means that we don't have to annually re-inspect it. Because, again, as a summary on the bottom there, if we have an expectation that for a large-scale housing association, some housing associations have got 100,000 properties. If it's a legislative requirement that we re-inspect every single item in all 100,000 of those properties, then it is a failure before we even start. So that's something that we need to consider as well. When we look at non-domestic aspects, the risk assessment should formulate the management plan. The management plan details the how, including how inspection frequencies are completed, etc. And the re-inspection of the asbestos in those areas is a legal requirement, with the management plan requiring annual re-inspection. Annual review. Re-inspections, however, have to be completed in line with what our risk assessments detail us in the asbestos management plan, not the arbitrary annual statements that a lot of organisations will sort of subscribe to. In the domestic aspect of the business, we've got wider reaching legislation. We've got a duty of care. The tenants are obliged to have a sort of safe environment to live. But the proactive inspection of asbestos or re-inspection isn't feasible. And therefore, when we look at the material and priority assessments which I've just gone through, if you imagine trying to do that, if you've got 6 figures of properties and you've got 10 items in each one of those properties, that's 1 million lines of data. And if you're going to complete a full material and priority assessment, it's setting it up to fail. But we can't ignore asbestos. So we need to know where asbestos is, but we sort of have to think about sometimes maybe outside of the box when we are responsible for people's safety at work, or where we've got tenants who are responsible or who we have an accountability for from a safety point of view there. And there's a couple of ways that we can kind of consider how this could be dealt with. And these are sort of examples that I've used or implemented or worked with organisations with in the past in regards to the domestics. Again, with the non-domestics, we've gone through that. It's the very sort of clear, categorised material and priority assessment. You're not obliged to use it, but if you are going to use something different to that algorithm, then you simply have to have a sort of explained justification why what you're doing is better than what the HSE have created. But in the domestic property, because as I've established, it's almost setting yourself up to fail if we try and implement the same system. So consideration for the material assessment, which the surveys will tell you, and couple that with the accessibility of a material, which again I would expect an asbestos surveyor to be able to make a judgment of. And in actual fact, if you look at the requirements of the United Kingdom accreditation services, the surveyors actually collect the data that would be able to complete our likelihood of disturbance, our accessibility scoring. So that information could be there, and if we put it into a spreadsheet, it's very easy to risk assess or risk rank on that one. That then would lead us to prioritisation of higher scoring items, informing tenants, telling the customers where asbestos is. I mean, this isn't just about domestics in this setting. Should we tell building occupants where asbestos is in their workplace? Are we going to have this open policy of informing people? Again, there are pros and cons. My personal take on it is, if we inform people, we're educating people, and we're almost explaining that we've got asbestos management, and then we're introducing another string to our asbestos management bow, because these people are now aware of asbestos, and therefore if they spot any deterioration, you've got another set of eyes looking at the asbestos again, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And as I mentioned there is a client that I work with that utilises their tenants by sending questionnaires out annually to see if the asbestos has changed. This is because they've got a very open policy with their customers where they've actually made them aware of asbestos. So every year they send them out a shot and they don't get 100% return. They don't get anywhere near 100% return, but it's over and above what they're obliged to do. And in some respects, it can be very beneficial to the business. So they're just a few considerations. And again, I am conscious of my timing, so I could spend an hour considerations and talking and waffling on. But I've got to talk about asbestos registers. So we've collected the asbestos survey data. The asbestos register empowers us to sort, rank, file, filter, and thus be able to have a global picture of asbestos in our buildings. Asbestos is present in a range of buildings. It's present in a range of states. You might be a large national retail client, and a large national retail client with a mass portfolio of 1960s buildings in shopping centres is going to have a very difficult approach to asbestos if they're trying to manage it based on a survey by survey basis. So they should have a global view, whereas a small single site will be far more straightforward to manage their asbestos. Even so, the creation of an asbestos register simplifies the process, and it also enables you to complete your annual reviews, your biannual reviews, how often those re-inspections are going to be completed. The survey report technically cannot be changed because the survey is a moment in time. It's a snapshot that happened, the asbestos was there, it's in whatever condition it was in. But the asbestos register allows us to evolve that, and it allows to evolve that and progress that and develop that over time. And over the life of a building, you are going to end up with multiple surveys, whether we start with your management survey and progress to refurbishment surveys for windows, and then we've had some doors, and then we've had some floors replaced. And so you end up with a 10, 15 documents, which all can be extrapolated into an asbestos register. It also then gives you the capacity to risk, rank, and file. And the question I've posed there at the bottom, if somebody all of a sudden waved a magic wand and gave me 5 grand, 50 grand, whatever number you want to pick, would I be able to, in 5 minutes, establish where I can spend that for the best benefit of the organisation that I work for? And that's a question I think to take away from this event and say, if that question was posed to me, how quickly could I get that information? Would I have to go trawling through reams and reams of archived survey documents? Or have I got a system whereby I can rank and sort? And I think, again, when we use the scoring, when we use the numbers of the material and priority assessment algorithms, for me, that is a very straightforward way of doing it. I've used a number of sort of proprietary asset management systems, and typically, if I'm wanting a quick sort of skim over things, I will quite often export the data into CSV and use Excel to manipulate the data so I can rank, file, and sort. So it's just my personal experience. So that's the importance of an asbestos register. And this really is the last slide that I've got to talk about. So I'm kind of on time to give us plenty of time for a question and answer session. But the content of an asbestos management plan, as I mentioned earlier, if we have a survey which has told us the hazard, and then we create our management plan based on that survey, we're managing asbestos based on hazard alone and not on risk. So what does a management plan have to include? Well, obviously we set out our aims and objectives, our statement. What is our asbestos management plan looking to achieve? And really that should be, we don't want people to be exposed to asbestos. We want to keep our asbestos in good condition. The roles and responsibilities. The asbestos management plan should really identify who is the overall accountable person, what we would define as the duty holder in control of asbestos regulations. But then we have responsible people. This can filter all the way down then to workers. What are our expectations for our workforce? What are the expectations that we hold for any contractors that we employ? We can include there in things like training and so on and so forth. Information regarding records. Where is that information held? How do we get to it? Again, what expectations do we have on provision of information for contractors and employees? How are we going to police this? How are we going to check that people are using the information that we've so lovingly put together? Action plans, process maps. What's the procedure that we have if we have a change of ownership of building? How do we flag these things up? How do we flag the occupancy changes? What's the procedure where we're having capital works or planned works completed, and whose responsibility is it for specifying the documentation? Do we use standard documentations when we're requesting surveys? And again, these are all things that I've encountered and kind of assisted organisations with, because we put a huge amount of faith, or clients put a huge amount of faith in consultants, and you request a survey, but without a suitable scope, you are essentially asking the surveyor to make the decisions, and therefore you leave yourself open or without recourse in the event that the surveyor's decision is incorrect. Then we've got the control mechanism detailing how works on our building is controlled. Is there a central sort of location where signing in takes place? I worked with a client historically who their requirements for any contractors carrying out works on site, on anywhere on their site, was the first port of call was the estates team, who would sit down, spend 10-15 minutes with the contractors and sort of implement the review of the asbestos register with the contractors in situ, so that they had a clear idea on what we were looking at. Then the communication of the information, how are we going to use it, what information are we going to share? And there have been various discussions. There's a UK national asbestos register now, which people can sort of buy into and put their information on. I don't think there's been too many significant take-ups of that, because people can be quite protective of their data, and there's still a stigma that's attached to the word asbestos, simply put. And finally, you know, and this isn't sort of exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. This is just, you know, these are 7 topics that I would consider to be the main core that could be fleshed out and built upon to create an overarching management plan. What do we do when it all goes wrong? What do we do when things go pear-shaped? And I think that, again, is a consideration that should always be factored in. And it will require sometimes site-by-site contingencies, depending on the alternative hazards, depending on the protocols, depending on the environments, or even depending on the asbestos that's been damaged or disturbed. So I think when we put these considerations into place, again, we can pad it out, we can flesh it out. But I have worked with organisations in the past where they've had a 175-page asbestos management plan. That to me is a little bit too fleshed out. So we want it to also be something that's a usable document, not filled with superfluous information, which you could say the same thing about asbestos surveys. Okay, so I reckon I've done about 40 minutes there. So I've got the opportunity now for any questions and answers or any questions that you guys might have. What's the protocol with questions and answers?
We haven't had any questions through as yet, but I just wanted to apologise to anyone who's having issues with today's presentation. Someone has let me know it restarted 10 minutes into the presentation, but that's not what I'm seeing. So apologies if you've had any issues. Vicky, do you have any questions for Matt?
Plenty. No, actually, I don't. I think that was a really useful summary of the management requirements and some really good case sort of studies there to understand why management of asbestos is so important. I think, you know, personally as a consultant, I see quite often asbestos management plans and the lack of review. Today I've just looked at one of an asbestos management plan that hasn't been reviewed for some time, and it's becoming quite apparent that as the organisation changes and the work that they do on surveying and removal of asbestos is not being captured in that plan. Is there you know, a requirement to update that plan on a specific period, or is it something that should be done, you know, as and when's required, I think, Matt?
So I think with the asbestos management plan, this is where the health and safety executive don't necessarily help people out, because there's an element of contradiction. So the approved code of practice says that you should review it at least annually. The guidance suggests 6 months to a year. This is for reviewing your asbestos management plan. But there's also certain catalysts, and I think I've touched on some of the catalysts whereby they should automatically trigger a review. And one of the things that I think sometimes people fail on is that sort of what catalysts are going to trigger this review. One of the obvious ones is asbestos gets disturbed. Now, it's not a case that sometimes that it's not the case that always it's because of a failure in the asbestos management plan. It may just be a circumstantial event. However, there should still be a review to say, could we have done something differently? Or what can we learn from this? And I think this is the point when we look at asbestos and other topics, to be honest, is it's a constant state of learning. So the annual review of your asbestos management plan, the change of the use of the building, reviewing your asbestos management plan and the change of reuse of a building, again, is a really big one that people don't always keep up on. And you see, you know, hospitals and schools and places like that where they'll change the use of an area and they don't necessarily then consider how asbestos might be impacted on that. Likewise, you know, with housing organisations, you know, your communal areas in your housing, they are under the auspices of Regulation 4, but the variables within those properties are the customers and the tenants. So therefore, if we change the tenants and we have, you know, antisocial behaviour issues, etc., that should trigger a review of the asbestos management plan, because the potential for asbestos to be disturbed increases. And I think that they're all variables, and so there isn't a one size fits all. And I think this is the problem sometimes with organisations, is that there has been a kind of, I suppose, an approach where organisations have sold you off the shelf packages, off the shelf asbestos management plans, the same way as people have bought off the shelf health and safety policies, etc. And you know, my understanding is the powers that be, the enforcement bodies, would far rather see no health and safety policy at all than an off-the-shelf one that doesn't fit the business. And I think with an asbestos management plan, it's very, very similar, because if you've got an asbestos management plan that's written for an organisation who have 20 people in the asbestos management team, but you've got one, it doesn't work. So I think that's where the sort of the trigger should be. Everybody should take ownership of it, and it doesn't need to be a 170-page document. So.
Good points there. So thanks, Matt. Julie, any questions come in now from attendees?
I can't see any on the chat bar. But
No,
I'm not sure if I'm seeing the right chat bar.
I don't. Yeah, same. I don't see any questions. Is there anything else that, you know, thinking about what you've talked about this evening, Matt, that you'd like to sort of add, and you know, or just as a real parting shot, if you like, to those that are watching
Vicky,
the webinar or
Vicky, sorry, I do have a question. I was on mute and didn't realise I clicked on it, hadn't clicked on it properly, so I do apologise. I'll start reading the message now. What would Matt recommend as an appropriate and suitable training for an, quotes, appointed person within a housing association with responsibilities for duty to manage? Would BOHS P407 be the minimum requirement, or is there a suitable alternative?
So P407 at the moment doesn't exist. The P407 has been put on hold by the BOHS. The P405 is the one that I would sort of push people in the direction of as a basic entry level. So there is talk that the BOHS are going to be rebranding the P407, but it's going to be released as the D407. There's a lot of sort of change happening within the British Occupational Hygiene Society, some of which is reflected in some of the guidance documents that's sort of evolved at the moment. I mean, in one of the guidance documents for asbestos consultants, for instance, there are currently 4 proficiency modules listed that don't exist, but they are actually written down in guidance. So there's a lot of change there. So the P407 was about asbestos management plans more so than the actual proactive asbestos management. So in terms of a duty holder in a housing organisation, I would say the P405 would be a good starting point. But then if you can get hold of somebody bespoke that can sort of help you look at how excuse me, how asbestos in housing, when it comes, because another thing as well that I would consider with something like the D407, as it will be inevitably eventually, is that it's going to be written for Reg 4. It's going to be written for the communal areas, and it won't necessarily capture the requirements of the domestic properties. So for instance, when I'm sort of advising, I do a lot of work with social housing providers. I would tend to say to organisations to create a separation in your asbestos management plan, which details how you deal with asbestos under Reg 4, but then how you deal with asbestos in the domestic properties when Reg 4 doesn't apply. So I know it's a very, very circuitous way of answering that question. But yeah, the P405, I would say, would be a very good starting point. I mean, there are sort of one-day duty to manage courses, which gives you a little bit of information. But if you are responsible for a housing organisation, I think getting something with a little bit of meat on the bones like the P405, the D407, I guess just watch this space, because it will be getting rebranded. It will be coming out again eventually by the BOHS. But as I say, where their priorities are going to lie, I'm not sure.
Great,
Thanks,
thank you.
Matt. I think it's also important just to add to that, the P405 is quite a lengthy qualification, if you like, of sort of 4 full days of training plus a practical and 2 other exams on the end of that. I think there is, you know, in terms of knowledge, there is a requirement to have a bit of a basic understanding of asbestos before you jump into that qualification. So if it is relatively new to you as an individual, perhaps consider some of the others, such as the duty to manage, which will give you a basic overview, and then the P405 will obviously build on that and go into a lot more detail, including around asbestos removal and things like that, and the management of it in buildings. So you know, if you do have any questions, our website, you can see our name there, we'll give you some more information. We are specifically housing related, so you can find the information you might be looking for on there about the P405. Hope that's okay, Julie. I think she might be on mute again.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. It's my mouse, the battery's running low. It's a battery operated wireless mouse. I've had a request, and if the answer is no, Matt, I completely understand. And we will be sharing the presentation on the YouTube channel, but somebody's asked if they can have a copy of your slides.
Yeah, I'm not precious about that, so.
Yeah. Okay, I can put those into a PDF.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say pop them into. I was just going to say pop them into a PDF, and absolutely, yeah, happy to share those.
Okay, thank you. And then the last couple aren't questions, they're just great presentation. Thanks, Matt. Really informative presentation. Thank you. Great presentation. So I think the consensus is it was an enjoyable presentation. So thank you so much. Over to you, Vicky, for closing comments.
Yeah, as I say, you know, I think there's so much more Matt could have talked about there, and we have literally just scratched the surface of asbestos management. But I think there's so much going on in the world at the moment. It's just a reminder to sort of not neglect your management duties, and actually, if you do, what can happen. So thank you, Matt, as ever, for your presentation and your expertise there, and thank you for joining us at this Scotland branch IIRSM webinar for this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. And can I just apologise again if anybody's had any issues with the presentation, because somebody's let me know it restarted 10 minutes in and I'm not sure how it happened. So please feel free to email at branches@iirsm.org if you had any issues, but I will check the recording before I upload it onto the YouTube channel. So that will now be available next week for you, and your attendance certificates, if you need them, will come out this time tomorrow. So thank you, Matt, for giving up your valuable time, and thank you, Vicky, for organising the presentation with Matt and giving up your valuable time. And I hope everyone has a good evening, and I'll see you all at the next Scotland branch webinar. Good night, everyone.
You will. Thanks, Julie. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.